On Sunday evening, June 9, 1935, at exactly 6:40 p.m., the sun was sinking behind the distant skyline of New York, painting the highway in shades of orange and gold. The air was heavy with summer heat, and the long stretch of Route 9 felt unusually quiet, broken only by the hum of passing automobiles and the occasional horn echoing through the open countryside. Inside a dark blue sedan, Mamie Johnson sat upright, her gloved hands steady on the steering wheel. She was dressed elegantly, as always, wearing a cream-colored hat and a pearl necklace that reflected the fading light. To most people, she looked like any refined woman returning from a weekend visit. But in Harlem, her name carried weight. She was not just Mamie Johnson. She was the wife of Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, a man whose influence stretched far beyond the streets of Harlem. As Mame drove closer to the city, she noticed a car trailing her from a distance. At first, she ignored it. In New York, suspicious cars were nothing unusual, but after several miles, the vehicle behind her began to move closer, its headlights flashing briefly. Another car soon appeared from the side road, slowly matching her speed. Her instincts told her something was wrong. She tightened her grip on the wheel and increased her speed slightly, but the cars followed. Moments later, one of them pulled ahead and slowed down abruptly, forcing her to brake. The second car stopped behind her, blocking any chance of escape. For a few seconds, the highway felt frozen in time. 3 men stepped out of the vehicles. Their footsteps were slow and deliberate. Their silhouettes stretched long across the asphalt. Mame remained seated, her face calm, though her heart was beating faster than she would ever admit. One man walked toward her window and knocked on the glass, not aggressively, with an arrogance that made the gesture feel worse than violence. Mamie rolled the window down just enough to speak. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, her voice controlled and dignified. The man smirked. "You're driving a little too confidently for this road," he said. "Thought we should remind you where you are." His tone carried something ugly beneath the words: contempt, arrogance, and the belief that he could say anything without consequence. Mamie understood the meaning instantly. This was not about traffic. This was about identity, about power, about sending a message. Another man circled her car slowly, inspecting it as if it were a trophy. He laughed quietly and whispered something to his companion. Their behavior was designed to humiliate, not to rob. They wanted fear, not money. Mamie refused to show it. "I have places to be," she said calmly. "If there's no legal issue, I'd like to leave." The first man leaned closer to the window. "Tell your husband," he said softly, "that the highway doesn't belong to Harlem." The words landed like a slap. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around her. Then, without another word, the men stepped back, returned to their cars, and disappeared into the fading light, leaving behind nothing but dust and silence. Mamie sat there for several seconds, staring ahead, her expression unreadable. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not chase them. She simply started the engine and continued toward Harlem. By the time she reached 125th Street, the city was alive with music and laughter. Jazz poured from clubs, people crowded the sidewalks, and Harlem looked as vibrant as ever. No one on the street knew what had happened miles away on that quiet highway. But when Mamie entered her apartment later that night, Bumpy Johnson was waiting. He stood near the window, his tall frame motionless, his eyes focused on the city lights below. He did not ask questions immediately. He did not rush toward her. He simply watched her walk in, place her purse on the table, and sit down slowly. After a long silence, he spoke. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. Mamie described the cars, the men, the words, and the tone. She did not exaggerate. She did not dramatize. She told the truth exactly as it was. Bumpy listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once. That was all. There was no shouting, no rage, no threats. But somewhere deep in Harlem, something shifted that night. By midnight, whispers began to move through the city. By dawn, people who had never met Mamie Johnson would know that something dangerous had begun. And although the men on the highway believed they had sent a message, they had not yet realized the truth. They had not humiliated a woman. They had awakened a force Harlem had feared and respected for years. On Monday morning, June 10th, 1935, Harlem woke up under a sky that felt heavier than usual. The streets looked the same, vendors calling out prices, children running past brownstone steps, men in pressed suits reading newspapers outside cafes. But beneath the surface, something invisible was moving. By 15 a.m., the story had already begun to spread. It didn't travel loudly. It traveled carefully. A barber on Lenox Avenue heard it from a customer who claimed to know a man who knew a driver who had seen the incident on the highway. A bartender near 135th Street heard it from a quiet man who ordered coffee instead of whiskey. A numbers runner heard it from a woman who never usually spoke about anything serious. Something happened to Bumpy Johnson's wife. No one knew the full details, but everyone understood the implication. In Harlem, reputation was currency, and humiliation was a declaration of war. Inside a narrow building above a small numbers office, Bumpy Johnson sat at a wooden desk, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting the room into thin stripes of gold and shadow. On the wall behind him hung a framed photograph of Harlem's skyline, taken years earlier when the neighborhood was still struggling to define itself. A man named Walter, one of Bumpy's oldest associates, stood near the door. "You want me to call the boys?" Walter asked quietly. Bumpy did not answer immediately. He picked up a cigarette, lit it slowly, and watched the smoke rise toward the ceiling. "Not yet," he said. Walter hesitated. "People are talking." Bumpy nodded slightly. Let them. That was the thing about Bumpy Johnson that unsettled people the most. Other men reacted with speed. He reacted with patience. And patience in his world was far more dangerous than anger. By late morning, visitors began arriving one by one. They didn't knock loudly. They didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared, men in tailored coats, businessmen with clean shoes, neighborhood leaders with quiet voices. Each one asked the same question in different ways. "Is it true?" Bumpy never gave them a direct answer. He listened more than he spoke, letting them reveal what they knew, what they feared, and what they suspected. From fragments of conversation, a clearer picture began to form. The men on the highway were not random troublemakers. They had connections, loose ones, but real ones, to groups that believed Harlem had grown too powerful, too confident, too untouchable. Someone, somewhere, had decided to test the limits. Around noon, Bumpy stood up from his chair and walked to the window. Below him, Harlem moved like a living organism. Cars rolled past, music drifted from open doors, laughter echoed from street corners. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. To Bumpy, it looked organized. "Want names?" he said calmly. Walter nodded. "We'll get them." "No," Bumpy replied. "Not like that." Walter frowned slightly. "I want names without noise, without fear, without mistakes. Anyone can pull a gun. I want truth." Walter understood what that meant. Instead of sending men with weapons, Bumpy sent men with questions. Drivers, bartenders, shop owners, musicians, and dock workers were quietly approached. Conversations happened in whispers, not threats. Information flowed through Harlem the way blood flows through veins, slow, steady, unstoppable. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had changed. People sensed something unusual. It wasn't panic. It wasn't excitement. It was expectation. Across the city, in places far from Harlem, a few men began to feel uneasy without knowing why. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Familiar faces avoided eye contact. The confidence they had felt 2 days earlier began to erode. In his office, Bumpy Johnson finally spoke again. "Whoever did this," he said quietly, "thought Harlem was asleep." Walter waited. "They thought humiliation was enough." Bumpy continued. "They thought silence meant weakness." He looked at the cigarette burning between his fingers, then crushed it slowly in the ashtray. "Now they're going to learn something," he said. Outside, Harlem kept moving. Music played. People laughed. Life went on. But beneath the rhythm of the city, something had started counting time, and everyone who understood Harlem's rules knew the same thing. When Bumpy Johnson stopped talking, it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. On Tuesday, June 11th, 1935, at exactly 2:30 a.m., Harlem was wide awake while the rest of New York slept. The streets were quieter than usual, but not empty. A faint glow spilled from club windows, taxi headlights cut through the darkness, and distant music floated through the humid night air like a warning no one could quite understand. In a small back room above a closed restaurant on 134th Street, Bumpy Johnson sat at a round table with 3 men he trusted more than most. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. No one spoke loudly. No one joked. This was not a meeting of gangsters. It felt more like a council deciding the fate of something larger than themselves. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocked, his gaze steady.
"What do we know?"
he asked. One man cleared his throat. "The cars were rented under fake names, but we traced one of them. The driver has ties to a group operating out of the Bronx. They're not big, but they've got friends." Bumpy nodded slowly. Another man spoke. The words they used weren't random. They wanted you to hear about it. They wanted Harlem to feel it. "That's what bothers me," Bumpy said quietly. The men looked at him. "They didn't want money," he continued. "They didn't want territory. They wanted attention." He paused, letting the idea settle in the room. "People who want attention," he said, "usually don't understand the cost. Outside, a train rumbled across elevated tracks, its metal wheels screeching against steel rails. For a moment, the sound drowned out the conversation. Then silence returned. By dawn, Harlem began to shift again. Bumpy's instructions were precise. No confrontations, no public displays, no unnecessary movement. Instead, he ordered something far more subtle. Watch everything, he told his men. Who meets who travels where, who suddenly starts acting nervous. Throughout the day, Harlem became a network of eyes and ears. Shoe shiners listened carefully to conversations. Taxi drivers remembered faces. Bartenders noticed who paid in cash and who avoided certain questions. Even children running errands picked up fragments of information without realizing their importance. By noon, Bumpy had a map, not on paper, but in his mind. He knew which neighborhoods the men came from. He knew which clubs they frequented. He knew which businessmen quietly supported them and which ones merely pretended not to notice their existence. But he still did nothing, was the part no one understood. Walter approached him late in the afternoon, his voice low. "We've got enough to move," he said. "If you want, we can end this tonight." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. "You ever see a storm coming?" he asked. Walter frowned slightly. "What? A real storm?" Bumpy said. "The kind where the sky gets quiet before it hits." Walter nodded slowly. "Quiet," Bumpy said, "is what scares people the most." He stood up and walked toward the window. Below, Harlem looked peaceful. Couples walked hand in hand. Men argued about baseball scores. Women laughed outside shops. Nothing suggested that the neighborhood was on the edge of something dangerous. But Bumpy knew better. By evening, small signs of tension began to appear outside Harlem. In the Bronx, a man who had once bragged loudly about putting Harlem in its place suddenly refused to leave his apartment. In downtown Manhattan, a businessman canceled an important meeting without explanation. Phones rang without answers. Rumors started to circulate. Bumpy Johnson is planning something. No one knew what, and that uncertainty was worse than any threat. Late that night, around 11:50 p.m., Bumpy sat alone in his office again. The city lights flickered outside the window like distant stars. On his desk lay a list of names, criminals, not targets but connections. He read them slowly, one by one. "These men," he said softly to himself, "think power comes from noise." He closed the folder and leaned back. "Power," he continued, "comes from control." Somewhere across the city, the men who had humiliated Mamie Johnson slept uneasily. They had expected anger. They had expected retaliation. They had expected chaos. What they got instead was silence. And they didn't yet understand that silence was not mercy. It was preparation. By the time the clock crossed midnight and Wednesday began, Harlem was no longer reacting to an insult. It was waiting, and when Harlem waited under Bumpy Johnson's command, the entire city eventually felt it. On Wednesday evening, June 12, 1935, at exactly 9:00 p.m., Harlem felt different. The air was thick, not with heat, but with expectation. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across sidewalks where people walked more slowly than usual, as if they sensed that something unseen was unfolding around them. No shots were fired, no sirens wailed, yet the city was on edge. Inside a crowded jazz club on the 133rd Street, A trumpet cried over soft piano chords, but the audience wasn't fully listening. Conversations drifted toward the same subject, spoken in half sentences and lowered voices. Something's happening. Across Harlem, men who normally laughed loudly now spoke carefully. Deals were postponed. Handshakes were shorter. People who once believed they understood Harlem realized they didn't understand it at all. In a quiet office above a storefront, Bumpy Johnson stood near a table covered with papers, maps, and handwritten notes. He was not surrounded by weapons. He was surrounded by information. Walter stood beside him, watching the streets through the blinds. "They're nervous," Walter said. "They should be," Bumpy replied calmly. By that evening, Bumpy's plan had already begun, not with violence, but with pressure. A businessman in the Bronx who quietly financed the men from the highway suddenly found his bank account frozen due to an unexpected investigation. Club owner who provided meeting space for them discovered that his liquor supplier had cut him off without explanation. A driver who once boasted about humiliating Harlem was questioned by police about an unrelated matter he thought had been forgotten years ago. None of these events seemed connected, but together they formed a pattern. Harlem was not attacking. Harlem was tightening its grip. Around 30 p.m., Walter returned from a short walk outside. "They're asking questions," he said. "People who used to laugh at Harlem are suddenly trying to make peace." Bumpy nodded slowly. "Let them talk," he said. He understood something most men didn't fear was more powerful when it had no clear shape. Elsewhere in the city, a group of men gathered in a dimly lit apartment in the Bronx. They were the same men who had stopped Mamie Johnson on the highway days earlier. Their confidence was gone. Cigarette smoke filled the room, and their hands shook slightly as they poured drinks. "This wasn't supposed to go like this," one of them muttered. Another man slammed his fist on the table. "He hasn't done anything." "No retaliation, no threats." "What's the problem?" "It's the problem." The first man replied. They realized something too late. They had provoked a man who didn't play by predictable rules. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked slowly down Lenox Avenue, his presence unnoticed by most people. He blended into the crowd like any other well-dressed man. Yet, everywhere he went, conversations stopped for a brief moment, resumed more quietly. He entered a small cafe and sat alone at a corner table. The owner approached him respectfully. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," he said. Bumpy nodded. Outside, Harlem continued its rhythm. Cars passed, music played, life went on. But beneath the surface, a message was spreading, not through newspapers, not through speeches, but through sudden changes in power. People who once felt untouchable were suddenly vulnerable. People who once ignored Harlem were suddenly cautious. Around 11:45 p.m., Bumpy returned to his office. Walter was waiting. "They're scared," Walter said again, this time with certainty. Bumpy looked at him calmly. "They should be scared of what they understand," he said, "not what they imagine." He walked to the window and looked out at Harlem's lights. "Tomorrow," he added quietly, "they'll understand." In the distance, a siren echoed briefly, then faded. The night swallowed the sound, leaving only silence behind. By the end of that evening, New York had not witnessed a single dramatic act. There were no headlines, no public confrontations, no explosions of violence. Yet something far more unsettling had happened. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone who knew how the city really worked understood the truth. Bumpy Johnson had delivered his message without firing a single shot. Harlem was no longer reacting. It was declaring itself. And for those who had dared to humiliate its queen, the realization arrived too late. The storm they had awakened was not loud. It was inevitable. On Thursday night, June 13th, 1935, exactly 11:45 p.m., Harlem stood under a sky filled with restless clouds. The streets were quieter than they had been all week, but the silence was not empty. It was heavy, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. People sensed that something had changed, in the way riots change a city, not in the way violence leaves scars, but in the way power quietly rearranges itself. Inside his office, Bumpy Johnson sat alone, the glow of a single lamp illuminating his face. The list of names that had once meant everything now lay folded neatly in a drawer. He no longer needed it. The work was done. Walter entered quietly and closed the door behind him. "It's over," he said. Bumpy looked up. "Nothing's ever over," he replied calmly. Walter hesitated. "They won't touch Harlem again. Not after this." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful rather than proud. "They didn't learn because they were punished," he said. "They learned because they understood." Outside, Harlem continued its nightly rhythm. Jazz floated through open windows. Couples walked beneath streetlights. Vendors packed up their carts. To most people, it felt like any other night, but beneath the surface, something invisible had been sealed. Across the city, men who once believed they could challenge Harlem had changed their behavior. Some moved their operations quietly to other neighborhoods. Others tried to make peace through intermediaries. A few disappeared from the scene altogether, not dramatically, but quietly, as if the city had simply erased them from its memory. No newspaper reported what had happened. No police statement explained it. Everyone in New York's underworld understood. Harlem had drawn a line. Bumpy Johnson walked slowly down 135th Street, his footsteps steady, his expression calm. People who recognized him nodded respectfully. Others felt his presence without knowing why. He stopped briefly outside a club where music spilled into the street. The trumpet sang, the piano whispered, and laughter rose above the rhythm. Harlem was alive, proud, and unbroken. For a moment, Bumpy thought of Mamie. She had not asked for revenge. She had not demanded justice. She had simply told the truth. And that had been enough. He returned home late that night. Mamie was sitting in the living room, reading quietly. When she looked up and saw him, she smiled faintly. "Everything all right?" she asked. Bumpy paused for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said simply. She studied his face, searching for signs of anger or satisfaction. She found neither. Instead, she saw something else, control. "You didn't have to do anything reckless," she said softly. Bumpy shook his head slightly. "I didn't," he replied. He sat beside her, the room quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. "People think power comes from fear," he said after a moment. "But real power comes from respect." Mamie nodded slowly. Outside, Harlem slept peacefully for the first time in days. By morning, the city would move on. People would forget the tension, forget the whispers, forget the quiet shift that had taken place beneath their feet. But legends are not built in headlines. They are built in moments no one can fully explain. From that week forward, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood surrounded by enemies and rivals. It was a territory defined by boundaries that no one dared to test again. And Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a man who ruled the streets. He had become something more enduring, a symbol, not of chaos, not of brutality, but of a quiet, calculated authority that could change the fate of a city without ever raising its voice. Years later, people would still tell the story in barbershops and back rooms, in whispers and half-truths. They would say, there was a time someone thought they could humiliate Bumpy Johnson's family. And what happened? Someone would ask. The answer was always the same. They learned that Harlem never forgets. And somewhere in the heart of New York, the legend of Bumpy Johnson continued to grow, not as a tale of violence, but as a reminder that some messages are so powerful, they never need to be spoken aloud.